Lie. I am not an expert. My background is basically a science teacher and not a home ec teacher. So, but you know, I have baked pies, obviously, for a number of years. My mother was the one that actually taught me how to do it. Now, during this program, if you guys have any questions or if you want to add a comment, that is fine because you're part of the learning experience too. And I will probably learn something from you guys tonight, and hopefully you will be able to at least take one thing home with you that might help you if you decide to make a pie soon. There, so. Okay, it's not that hard to make a pie. I mean, of course you need a few directions and stuff. Even young people, as depicted here on the screen, can learn to make a pie. This is my favorite granddaughter when she's around, and then I have another favorite granddaughter when she's around. But anyway, she's the oldest granddaughter, and it's been fun watching her grow up. And so one day, Laura, did you check to see what date that was or not?
I did not.
That's okay. It was either this summer or last summer when she was either 15 or 16, I guess, when I decided one day that I think we'll just learn to make a pie today, Rachel. And the one that she's holding on the right-hand side was her finished result. I have no idea what kind of a pie we made, but she listened to directions really, really well. And I was surprised at how well she ended up with doing that there. So obviously we learn pie making just like we learn other things by observing, by listening, reading, and I would expect that you guys are not expecting to be perfect at it if you've never baked a pie. How many people have never baked a pie here? 1, 2, 3. Hey, well, you should be over here, guys. No wonder they're having this program. So some of you are very experienced, I'm sure, and probably you can teach me a thing or two too. So please do. But even experts have flops. Now, I was called an expert by Aaron, and here is my flop. I'll talk about it a little bit later. It's not that floppy, though. So where did I learn? Basically, I learned mainly from watching my mom. She taught 4 of us girls how to make cakes, cookies, and pies, and that was about it. When I got married, I knew nothing about how long to bake a baked potato or fry a chicken leg, but I knew how to make desserts. But man cannot live by dessert alone. I found that out. So anyway, she did all the meat and potato type of dishes. So I learned to bake from my mom. And she said that she would have loved to have worked in Betty Crocker's test kitchen. That was one of her dreams, that she would have liked to have done that. But one of her hobbies sort of related to that because she loved to thumb through magazines and look at recipes and copy recipes. And I have a good example of that here. All of these are my mom's handwritten recipes. She had a chest of drawers made especially to this size to hold the large recipe cards. And guess what? It has 16 drawers in it, just like this. And most all of the drawers are filled to the brim with copied recipes. Plus I have boxes of torn out things from magazines. When she died about a couple years ago, she was 101 and a half, and the 4 girls inherited lots of cookbooks. And I think it was a year or 2 ago that I donated 143 cookbooks to this library. Now, some of those cookbooks, granted, were not, you know, the thick ones. They're little pamphlets like you sometimes pick up at the state fair or at the checkout counter, but 143. And I have her disease, too. So I didn't give away all my cookbooks at all. I have a pretty big collection there, too. So anyway, not too many people have furniture like this. Galen Mack was the one, do you know Galen? Yeah? No? Okay, from Claremont was the one that did that. And then whenever she went into a store that had cookbooks, it was almost like a magnet was drawing her to these cookbooks. And she'd thumb through them while the rest of us were looking at other things. And if she saw a recipe that she really thought she would like to try, she thought, I'll just memorize it. And when I get the car, I'll write it down. And that's what she did. I don't see how she did it, but she did that. And Mom baked pies, but she didn't bake just a pie. She most always made 3 or 4 pies at one time, knowing how piggish her girls were. So the next slide, look over there, and the final slide is a picture of my mom. I'm guessing she was like 80, 85-ish at that time. And there's her banana pies that she made. There were lots of bananas that were going bad, so we had pies to give after she got done. Then another time, our apple trees at home were really maxed out one year. And being in her generation, you never let anything go to waste. She worked with her crippled arthritic hands, hand peeling, no apple peeler, and made 80 frozen pies that fall. She was visiting us for 2 or 3 weeks. And I can't imagine that. But that was my mom. Okay, so that's where I learned, and that's the end of our slides there. So anyway, on with the show. So let's start with one of her recipes. You have a handout there. And there are 3 recipes on this handout. The one I'm going to talk about, 2 of them are hers, but the one I want to talk about is the one that's in yellow on the bottom of it. So, most of your pie recipes are going to be very similar. Some will have you adding baking powder, or not soda so much, vinegar, a different kind of flour maybe, or so forth. But basically you're going to have flour, shortening, salt, and some kind of liquid there. And one of the keys to making a flaky pie crust is to use cold ingredients. Now, what I've done here is I've measured out that 1.5 cups of flour, and I've put in this happens to be Crisco. All of the, I ran out of lard. All of the pie crusts that you'll be working with tonight have lard in them. But this is about, and I'm going to pass this around, or at least show it to you here, so you can see about how crumbly you should make your, I mean, you don't want to keep stirring and stirring and stirring. There's lumps in it, and that's okay. There are lumps of, I could take that one, for example. He's a pretty big one. I can't use one for it. And punching down and making smaller, but it's really not that necessary. So, cold shortening is a key to making a flaky pie crust. It's harder to work with the cold cold shortening, but it works a little bit better. And if it's too cold, I would let it bring it up to room temperature a little bit more there. But if you take like a Crisco can and pull it out of a top cupboard, it's going to be pretty warm, and it won't do quite as well.
So excuse me, so you want to refrigerate it, or not quite that cold?
If you refrigerate it, it depends on how long you refrigerate it. You don't want it to be in there like 24 hours or anything like that. But to a couple of hours before, maybe.
So you can
have
measure
3
it out
pounds.
and
Yeah.
put it in a container, put it in the fridge. Okay.
And then the other key, it's cold, cold, cold is what the key to this pie crust is. This is ice water. And at home, I always just throw the water in, probably the same cup, measuring cup, and put ice cubes in it. And then when I dip it out, I think this recipe calls for 1/4 cup of water. Oh, I made a mess there. I just dip in, and it says to gradually add your water and start stirring. So I'm going to do that. Now, depending on the humidity of the air, that's going to make some difference in your water. So if after stirring this up, I would see that it was too dry, I would probably just add like a teaspoon at a time of water into it, but we'll see how this goes. as you stir it, it'll start to glue itself together, and it'll start to separate from the sides of the bowl. Now, I always think that hands were made before forks. So I oftentimes will use my hands to help out just a little bit better. And I'll show you what this is looking like here in a minute. Another thing, and we'll talk about this, I have a page that I'm going to hand out to you called Hints. This, to me, is a little dry, and I'm going to put just a little bit more water in it. So it's started to come together, and it definitely is starting to scrape itself away from the sides.
Yeah.
That's what you want to watch with your making homemade bread too, is that it needs the dough needs to pull away from the sides of the bowl. So it's getting there, but it's not quite as moist as what I would like. So I'm going to just dump a little more water in here. Maybe it's dry. You suppose we got low humidity in here? That's looking better. I'll show you this too for now. This is just about right. Can you see the consistency has changed? Look at this. I don't know if it was exactly a teaspoon of water that I put in there, but it's beginning to cling to itself just a little bit better, doesn't it? Can you see, honey? Okay. So, sure, I'll show the camera. I don't know where I'm showing it. See how it's clinging together, camera? Oh dear. I'd hate to be on a cooking show, they'd fire me. For sure. So here's where the hands come in. We're not gonna eat this, so don't worry about it. Demonstrations.
You want to look at the camera and just do one smile? Thank you.
So your bowl should almost be clean. Still have to wash it with soap and water afterwards, but we're getting a nice single ball here, which is what we want. Right? Camera, can you see? So this recipe that you've got there is supposed to make 2 pie crusts, or enough for a double pie. I would say that it probably would not be enough for a 10-inch pie, because it's pretty, pretty skimpy for that. And even for a 9-inch pie, I had to roll it out just a little bit more. So my solution to that is, like my mother, I never hardly make 1 pie. So I double the recipe, and if there's some left over, that's fine. You can freeze this dough, could be frozen. Just thaw it out and use it just like you would right now. So the next step, then, if you're going to start to roll it, is I just sort of mold it a little bit. Spank it.
You know what I like to do with the leftover pie dough is roll it out, put sugar and cinnamon on it.
Oh, yes. That's
Absolutely.
sometimes more delicious than
Yeah,
the
I've been
pie
saving it
itself.
too.
Yeah. So have a little thing here. Now this is waxed paper, and the reason I'm doing waxed paper tonight is because this table is a little bit bumpy instead of smooth like your counters probably are. And then also, a lot of your recipes will even recommend that you use the wax paper to roll it out on, and they even say, put another sheet of wax paper over this. There. So flour is a necessity, and you need to flour both. Oh, I got way too much there. Your roller. Oh, before I go any further, I forgot to tell you. Now you notice that I use the fork to get my dough. This is called a pastry cutter, and a lot of people like to use it. I use it to start with, but then I go to my fork, afterwards. So enough said about those two things. Yeah. So,
What about using a pastry cloth?
and that's a good idea too. I don't even own one, probably because my mother never did. Do you have one, Margie? And you like
That's
it?
what we use to make left side.
Oh, sure,
Pastry cloth.
sure. Okay, so when you're rolling the pie dough, the amount of pressure you put on it is going to determine how quickly it spreads out. I don't like to put a lot of pressure on it at first because I like to get the little circle thing sort of started before I do much pressure. And now this is a disadvantage of the wax paper because it's
Yes.
scooting all over.
Wet the
There.
table first and put the wax paper down.
That's a good idea, and I accidentally wetted it here. I just hope it doesn't get in my pie crust. Yeah. So, you know, I get it out to about this size of a circle, and then I want to turn it over, and I want to get a lot of that flour off, because there's a point when you get too much flour that you're going to have a tougher pie crust there. Also, overworking your pie crust, like if I kept stirring and stirring and stirring, that's going to make a tougher pie crust. So the least amount of time that you can spend in stirring your dough or handling it, the better off you are. So, for example, when you have the leftover outskirts of your pie, you can reuse those again, but if you keep reusing them, you can bet that your latter crusts are going to be pretty tough there. So, all right, now this is not going to be perfect, it's just for demonstration, so I'm going to roll and roll. They usually say to roll towards you. I do both, and I get it to roll. This is how I did your pie crust that you're working with tonight, just about like so. And you need to roll clear out to the edges so that you don't have a thick edge and a thin center. So that even rolling is important. I got a thick edge here, so I'm going to work on it just a little bit. Then to get the pie crust that I did for you guys tonight, I just took a plate like that, and then I took a knife, but I didn't bring one, so here's a spoon, and cut around the edge, just like this. Lift up the plate, get rid of the scraps, and then we have our pie dough ready to go. So this is the size plate that you guys, or pie tin you're using tonight. This is way too big. But the next thing you'll do is place your pie dough in here. Now at home, if you like a thick crust on the edge, this amount hanging over is just fine. But if you don't like such a thick edge, just trim this off, and then when you go to squeeze the top together on it, you'll be fine. Laura, I need a little bit of pie filling. Okay, one of the hints that we're going to talk about is, why is the bottom of my pie always so soggy? You have the problems with that, you people that have made pies before? Well, you need to seal the bottom of this. That will help. One thing that will help is if you use either corn syrup, thank you, or egg whites that are sort of frothy, and put that right on the bottom. So I thought it'd be easier to use corn syrup tonight. So you're going to be doing this too if you want. Just layer a little corn syrup on the bottom, and the little extra sweetness won't hurt a bit, right?
Right.
Okay, so sort of spread that out. It's a little bit thicker than what I thought it would be. It's probably not very warmed up yet from being in the car. All right, so I'm going to get rid of that. So now we've got our sealer on there. Another thing, and we'll find this in the hint page that I'm going to talk to you about too, but when you put this pie in the oven, don't put it in the middle shelf. Put it on the bottom shelf. It's closer to the heat. And what you need to do is to have that heat melting this shortening in here so that it makes a barrier. So we're going to put liquid pie filling in it. And if you have a barrier, like melted shortening, you can't get water to go through melted shortening, can you? No. So that will be a barrier, and then your pie crust can crisp up a little bit better on the bottom. So we'll talk about that later too. Okay, and I did not, oh yes, I did bring a spoon here. We have no idea how much pie filling these little things are going to take, but I'm going to put just a little bit. This is not gonna be a pie that we're probably gonna bake. So I've just put a little bit of pie filling in here so we can demonstrate what we want to show you here. So next thing, we've got another pie crust that we need to roll out.
When you put the filling in, do you put it in so it's level, or do you mound it?
Well, I usually mound it because I
Mound it.
like a lot of
Yeah.
in the pie there. So you can see that this is a huge amount of dough that I'm working with. Actually, I'll show you. This is about the size of ball that I worked with for what I just did there. So we're gonna pat it out again the same way.
So Anita, is it okay to bake your pie then on that bottom shelf the whole time?
Actually, in the hints, we'll talk about that, but no, I think if you bake it like 15 minutes on 450, and then turn your oven down a little bit, and you can move the pie up or turn it around if your oven is hot on one side or the other. That's probably better to do it. Yeah. And you gotta know that when you make a pie, you're gonna have a little bit of a mess. So don't worry about it. You're gonna have to clean it up a little bit. Yeah. I'm just getting a little excess out here. I'm really pushing harder on this now to get that to spread out. Your bottom crust should be, and they probably aren't tonight. I don't have no idea what kind of crust you're gonna end up with. They say that most crust should be about 1/4 of an inch thick. And you can measure that by putting 2 quarters together, and that's about 1/4 of an inch. But your bottom crust should be a little bit thicker because it's gonna have that liquid hanging on it than what your top crust is. So we'll cut this again and see what we come up with here. Okay, so now we've got to make some vents in here for the steam to escape. So what I usually do is to fold it in half and make sure you've got some flour on here so it's not going to stick. So, and this is a pretty thick pie crust. The thicker it is, the easier it's to work with. And I usually run with a knife down the center. And if you can't see me, just stand up if you want to do that. I'll wait till you, so you can see. So I just go down the center and make some marks like so. Do you want to see my marks? Here's my marks.
You cut all the way through?
I do, cut all the way through. Yeah, now I have a fork here somewhere. There we go. And then, this makes it look a little fancier, I guess. I try to poke all the way through, but I won't be making it, I know. So then when I unfold it, I usually take and make the crust even on the back side and go like that, sort of even it up. And you can see that I didn't get pokes on this side because I didn't poke all the way through, so then just come back and do some pokes here, like so. Any questions so far?
That's neat. So basically, it's what you did was, if we take a full pie crust, you know what I'm saying, a full 9-inch pan, and put that in there, and then is what you're saying is that, like when we do the top, we put the pan on top and cut around it, right?
Oh, you know what? At home, I don't bother to do this cutting. I let it hang all over, and I take a scissors and
Oh, and then cut it,
and go
okay.
all the round way and cut it. But I did it tonight because it makes it easier to demonstrate.
It sure did, it looked good.
Good, good. So now, where the next thing is called crimping or fluting your pie. And, you know, remember when you used to make paste out of flour and water? Maybe you don't, you're not old enough to know that, but you can do that. Sorry about that. So I, lots of times, will take water and put it around that bottom crust because that's gonna make it a lot easier to do your crimping. And this paper right here, you're welcome to look at it later, it has a lot of different designs. Oh my gosh, if you go on the internet, you can find so many beautiful designs. If you have time to mess with it, it's really fun. I usually just use my old-fashioned method, which is lifting up that bottom, lifting up the bottom crust about like so. And if you can't see, stand up again. Yeah. So lift that up, and then I sort of fold this over, and then I go zoop, like so. So it's a motion like this. You're holding onto it with your thumb and forefinger, and then you twist in opposite directions. Now you need to do this because this is going to seal the pie from running all over. I still use the cookie sheet.
Yeah.
So we'll crimp it up. And another way that's an easy crimping method is just to use a fork and go all the way around with the tines of a fork. And this is much more crust than I would normally do on I've rolled it pretty thick, really. And it's more than what I would normally do. So if you find when you get over to your stations that you don't want that much pie dough on, just use something to cut some of it off, I guess. Or if you don't have to eat this either, you know, a lot of people don't eat the crust, but we do need to get it sealed there. So basically, I'm not going to spend time sealing this whole thing, but you can begin to see what it's looking like there. And you'll see on the pies that we're going to eat too, what it looks like. Okay, any questions so far?
You know what I was gonna say is, I don't know if anybody's bought one of these before. I got mine at Bed Bath & Beyond. It's like an oven liner. It's this Teflon type thing. If you had one of those, I absolutely love it. So if your pie oozes out, it goes right down below on that, and you can wipe that thing off.
Yeah, it's neat, neat. Okay, so I think we're done with that part. Now next, we're going to go into the hints. Now, you don't have any hints yet, so somewhere I've got a handout. If you want to just, Margie, you want to hand these down to the people. Thank you. We'll go over those, and we'll talk about those, and then it's going to be kind of operate here for you. Well, there's going to be 2 sheets now that you have. Yeah, oh, I see, you guys are together. Now, you've got one sheet already, and then this is your second
Grab
sheet.
one, because I make notes.
Yeah, there's enough for everybody.
Everybody gets what you say too?
Yeah.
No, I think.
Yeah.
Everybody gets 2,
Times
right?
the ID
You will
number.
have a total of 2 sheets now that
Total.
I've passed out.
Oh,
Yeah.
People want
Sorry,
times.
I confused you a little bit.
Your hint sheet.
Then I'll take an extra one. Okay, thank you. So some of these I just picked up in the last couple of years. And, you know, just keep searching on the internet, talking to people that make pies, and you'll eventually get it all together and have a good result. Okay, cutting and the shortening. I've already talked about chilling and the shortening, so we don't need to say too much about that. Don't over mix it, that makes it tough. Make sure the liquid is cold, we talked about that. And then your dough, it's gonna be like just an experiment if you're a new pie baker to see when that dough is ready to form that ball. So it can't be too dry, but if you make it too wet, you're going to have a tough pie crust. It won't be flaky. So there's just like the just right place there. And you saw me add the little bit more liquid there. Okay, when you roll out the pastry, it's suggested that you let it stand for 15 minutes if it's been refrigerated to bring it up to room temperature. And then we talked about whether you use wax paper or not. But flour the wax paper if you use it, because just the wax paper by itself will not let that dough loose so that you can turn it or twist it there. 9-inch pastry, they usually say make a 12-inch circle. So that means 3 inches wider than your pie pan, doesn't it? Yeah, I mean, technically, but you gotta divide that by 2 because you're going 1/2 on each side there. So like an inch and a half bigger on that circumference than what your pie pan actually is. So sometimes you just have to set your pie pan on the dough and see how much it's extending, because you gotta make room or allowance for that pie dough to go up the sides of your pan, so don't forget that, yeah. Soggy bottom pie crust. Part of the time, like we talked about, on the lower rack, that will concentrate the heat and help that crust crisp itself up. Before adding the filling, we talked about this, either use corn syrup or egg whites to help make a seal. Now here's something that I think is extremely important. If you have your oven going up to the temperature that you want it, and then you put the pie on your cookie sheet, and then put the cookie sheet and the pie in the oven, it's gonna take a while for that cookie sheet to heat up. We want that shortening to melt and make a seal in there. So put the cookie sheet in first and get it hot, and then set the pie on top of that. Then we talked about the bottom crust slightly thicker there. Okay, fluting the pie. Single crust pie, the raised flute edge prevents the filling from overflowing, obviously. So you probably wouldn't want to use the fork method of just making a flat edge if you're gonna do a single crust pie. Okay, so I brought a single crust pie tonight, and you can see with a single crust pie, you have to use some kind of a fork to make little holes in it. This one had a problem riding in the car. There. And that shows about how far apart your fork marks need to be. I always say the more fork marks, the better, because steam's gonna come up, and it's going to make that crust bubble up or shrink. That's the nightmare.
My mom does that, I never knew why.
Okay?
Do know.
Yeah. Now, this little slit that you see on the side that was in there when I brought it out of the oven, but that wouldn't hurt. I mean, you can still put a filling in there and it would be okay. The top fluting edge just happened in the car. So here's how I baked this crust last night. I put it in, fluted it, made the fork marks, and then I put a sheet of aluminum foil. I'm not going to do this as perfectly as, you know, what I'm just showing you the idea. So the foil goes way out the bottom, make sure it comes up. I did not turn it over because we want the top of the crust to get a little brown there, so I just let it stick up like this. And then, as I think that sheet says, you can either use rice or beans in that. It sounds funny, but that's going to put weight on that pie, so it's not going to bubble up and do its shrinking thing like that. And I have had really good luck with my pie crust not shrinking down. Have you ever bought a pie crust from the store and tried to make a single pie crust for it? And invariably mine will just go down the pan. And then I'll have no crust for the top there. So that's the hint.
Does it matter if you got the shiny side up or down?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, it might, but I don't know the difference.
Anita, did you just save that rice then from one
Yeah,
time
you
to the
could,
next?
I mean, actually, rice could be cooked right away, but I'm just gonna put it back in the bag and I'll use it for that purpose again there.
Okay.
And beans work out, they say, just as well, but I had rice in my cupboard handy. The beans were downstairs. Okay, where are we at here? Okay, when we did that double crust pie, I talked about wetting your finger and putting that around the bottom crust there. Get some ideas for fluting pies from that paper I showed you, and turn the paper over. Baking the pie, most recipes, and you do need to follow your recipe, but most will say 425 for about 15 minutes, and then reducing it to down to 375 for the rest of the time. Now we're working with a cooked filling, and some of your pie recipes won't designate whether it's a cooked filling or like apple pie, for example, with fresh apples. They're absolutely a different length of time there because you want your apples, your fresh fruit, to be sure that they're done. And lots of times I will just poke with a little knife in there and see if they're tender there. But I don't think on a cherry pie filling like we're using tonight that you probably would need to bake it 45 or 50 minutes like most of the recipes would tell you there. Okay, and we talked about the bottom rack there. I think we talked, okay, here's one thing, and I did not do this with that pie crust. It says for a single crust pie, after fluting the edges, prick the sides and bottom of the pastry with a fork. Then it says to freeze it for 20 minutes. I did not do that, nor did I refrigerate it. I think the idea of freezing is it solidifies, again, I think it's a shortening issue, and it probably solidifies that, and who knows? Okay, at any rate, freeze it if you want, and if you don't, do it like I did there. Okay, now, sometimes we make pies and we just don't want to use them right now, so we can freeze many kinds. You cannot freeze custards and like lemon pie and stuff like that. I don't care if you see them in the grocery store frozen, they're just not good. In my opinion, there. Okay, so if you want to just store the crust, like if I wanted to take that crust and just put it in a Ziploc bag, already baked, I could do that. When I take it out of the crust, I would let it thaw out just a little bit, and then I would put it in the oven just for a few minutes. This is a baked single crust now, to let it crisp up again, and then it would be ready to put your filling in. Now, if you put the single unbaked crust in the freezer, let it thaw out a little bit, and then bake it just as you would normally, just as if you had rolled it out fresh. There. Okay, da-da-da-da-da. 2 crust pies next here. They can be frozen, either baked or unbaked. And there's 2 different ways that you bake your frozen pie, depending on whether you baked it to start with or if you put it in raw. And I think this talks about that here. If you're planning on freezing a pie, it is good to add an extra tablespoon of thickener, like your flour or cornstarch. And it's best not to cut the vents in it at the point that you're going to put it in the freezer. Wait until you're ready to bake it and then put the vents in it. I think that is partly because of the drying out issue. You know, as things freeze, they tend to dehydrate a little bit there. Okay, as far as the length of time, I have taken pies out that have been in the freezer 6 months. Baked them, and I could not tell the difference. So even though your recipes may say you can keep it up to 3 months, if you don't have it baked in 3 months, don't throw it out. And of course, when you're freezing things, you want to make sure you wrap them real well so they don't dehydrate there. Okay, so if you have a frozen pie, baking frozen pies is where I'm at now. When you're ready to bake a baked single, I already talked about this, thaw it and then crisp it up a little bit before you put the filling in it. An unbaked pie, single pie, just like we said, do it just like you would if you would have baked it after you thawed. Now, we've got an unbaked 2 crust pie coming up now. That's what you're gonna go home with, an unbaked 2 crust pie. Before you bake that pie, if you freeze it, don't thaw it out. Take it directly from the freezer and put a cookie sheet in the oven on the lowest rack, let it heat up, cover the outside part of the crust, sometimes with aluminum foil, just the outside of the where it fluted edge there. And then bake at 425 and then turn the heat down to 350 and another 45 minutes there. And you can move it to the center rack rather than keeping it on that bottom like we've talked about before. That's just one method of cooking, or baking I should say, an uncooked 2 crust pie. If you go on the internet, you will find other ways to do it. So this is not the one and only way. Now, you can also bake pies before freezing, and I have never really done that. I usually froze my pies uncooked there. But if you decide you want to cook them before and then freeze them, here's how you do it. When you take it out of the freezer, thaw it out for 4 or 5 hours. So you really have to be a planner ahead of time there. But when it reaches room temperature, then you're ready to pop it in the oven. Cover it with plastic wrap while it's thawing out, and that will prevent condensation from coming in on the inside and dripping down on top of your pot. So that's a little hint there. And then bake it on the lowest rack, 15 minutes at 350. Notice the difference in temperatures at your single crust pie and your double crust pie. And then move it to the center of the rack. Okay, that is it for hints. Now, that's a lot to absorb, but you have a paper to take home. Do you have any questions or comments? Things that you have found that helps with making or baking a pie, because that's what we've done so far.
How long would you just bake the pie crust? If you were just gonna do a single and then put something in it that doesn't have to go back in the oven?
Okay, so you're talking about
Yes.
how
that.
long did I bake this when it
Yes.
was raw? I think it was about 15 minutes. Now,
And
remember,
like
I had the rice and stuff on it, so I couldn't really tell what it looked like. You go a lot about sight, really, because you don't want this to get real brown on the bottom, but yet you don't want it to not be set and have a little bit of tan color too. So at the end of 15 minutes, which was the recommended time, I think, I took this out and I looked at it and I'm going, I think it needs a little more time. So I said to Alexa, turn the alarm on for 2 more minutes. But lo and behold, I looked in the oven at 2 minutes and it was ready to pull out. So I think
And is that at like 425?
that was at 425, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I think you can, some recipes will tell you at 450, but I think that one was at 425. Anybody else?
That was on the middle then? Or did you put it
That
on
one was on the middle.
the middle?
Yeah, that one I did on the middle. You could do it on the other. Okay.
I got a question for you.
Yeah.
too. What do you prefer for tins that when you bake your pies?
They say that aluminum and glass tins heat up quickly as compared to a stainless steel one. I have mostly stainless steel pans that I use for
That's what you,
baking.
I mean, kind of
But
recommend, that's
that
your
would be my
choice.
preference. Well,
Yeah,
for one
okay,
thing,
I
you know,
know.
we've had the scare on aluminum and how it might affect your body. So, and stainless steel holds up and glass breaks and it's heavy. And I don't know, I just have mostly stainless steel. I do have glass and I do have some aluminum, but I prefer that. Maybe it's just a matter of preference. Now, I want to go over the recipes of the pies that we're going to eat tonight, and then we'll go make yours. So on the back side, or somewhere, probably on the back side of your recipes. Yeah, that's where it's at, so hang on here. Set it on the front table here, honey. Okay, let me talk about the failure. What's not a failure? The flop. Okay. Meringue pies are noted for the meringue pulling away from the crust. But you can solve that. I'm not sure that that's written on the hint page, but if it's not, well, you can write it down here. I had a friend that told me this one time, and I have tried it, but I've forgotten the complete story of it. So last night when I made these, or late yesterday afternoon, I thought, I'm gonna try, see if I can make this perfect and not have it shrink. So what you do is when the meringue is nice and brown on the top of the little tips, leave the pie in the oven. Turn off the temperature and let it cool down slowly in the oven. Well, what I couldn't remember is if I was supposed to open the oven door or not.
You think it would
As
keep
it
baking?
cooled. See, when things cool, what do? Science class? Shrink, don't they? The molecules come together closer. So if this thing cools too fast, that meringue is going to have the molecules come together and it'll pull away from the edges. It was very interesting when I pulled that pie out of the oven. I'm going like, oh, this is going to be a really good lesson. I did it accidentally. But when I pulled the pie out of the oven, now it's had travel time and stuff today, the back side, where it was hotter, was all adhered to the crust, no shrinkage. But the front side, where the oven had been opened and therefore cooled faster, had slightly shrunk from the edges. And if you look real closely at this thing, you can tell which was the back and which was the front of the oven. So just close the oven door and let it go. Now, I would advise looking at the pie once in a while so it doesn't get, too browny here. But evidently it doesn't, because this, sat in the oven like 2 hours or so after I shut it off. But of course I had the door open a little bit there. Anyway, that's the lesson on the lemon pie. Let's go through the lemon pie recipe real quickly here. Oh, I'm gonna back up just a minute. Turn to your pie crust page. I want to talk about those 2 other pie crusts just a minute. Pie crust number 2 on the right top. That is also one of my mom's recipes, and I made that for years. It requires, after you put the boiling water in with the shortening, it requires that you refrigerate it. So it's not quite as quickly done as this bottom crust is, but I like it equally as well. But lately I've just been doing the bottom crust, or the bottom recipe there. Okay, then the gluten-free pie crust, I got that recipe Tuesday night at a ball game from a friend that you know.
Who was it?
Reavers, Marcia.
Oh,
Yeah, she evidently has someone in her family that needs to have gluten-free stuff, and she makes this pie crust all the time. I've never made it. Well, upon her recommendation, though, I will put that in there for you guys, so if you have some need for that sometime.